Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about new cultural criticism. So let's begin. It is said that culture is a collection of interactive cultures, each of which is growing and changing, each of which is constituted at any given moment in time by the intersection of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, occupation, and similar factors that takes into account human experience. In matter of cultural criticism, we can say that cultural criticism analyzes how different religions, ethnicities, class identification, political beliefs, and views affect the ways in which texts are created and interpreted. Taking into account what I just said, we can examine Pocahontas movie since it is exposed ethnicity and social class. Ethnicity, since it is talk about the Powhatan tribe, and social class, since let's say that Pocahontas was poor, and the man with whom she falls in love is from the high class. Another example that can be examined in matter of culture criticism is the Phantoms of Scrooge, which shows the difference in social class between Scrooge and Fred. Cultural criticism shares some similarities with historical criticism. For example, cultural criticism and historical criticism have in common the view that with human history and culture, we can construct only a partial or subjective picture. It means that we cannot have a precise view of how culture works due to subjectivity. Furthermore, both fields share the belief that individual human develops in a give-and-take relationship with its culture milieu, while we are constrained within the limits set for us by our culture. Also, we may struggle against those limits or transform them. Although cultural criticism seems to be almost identical to historical criticism, they differ in the fact that cultural criticism talks about political theories as Marxism, feminism, since they also make part of culture. We may consider The Great Gatsby as an example of this, since this book can be analyzed regarding feminist, Marxist, African American, and lesbian gay queer criticism. High and low culture. Culture critics believe that high and low culture was defined by the dominant class to reinforce its own image of superiority. The dominant class dictates what was considered as art, which in this case was everything done by the high class, such as the ballet, the opera, and other fine arts that made part of high culture. In contrast, the low culture was characterized by actions such as watching TV, listening to music, listening to popular music, and reading Pulp Fiction. And with Pulp Fiction, I don't mean the movie. That term describes a huge amount of creative writing. Pulp Fiction magazines were recognized by having low quality paper, and because of this, the magazines were cheap and affordable for everyone. Also, in matter of excluding cultures, during the slavery age, African Americans were recognized by eating a lot of fried chicken and watermelon. This stereotype was created to dehumanize and deride African American, and it was said, open quotation marks, they were so lazy and primitive that their ambition was not wealth, social power, or education. They only settled for food. Cultural criticism also analyzes oppressed groups since they often have relation with political agendas. However, different from political theories which describe oppressed groups as helpless victims, new historical and cultural criticism views oppressed groups as both victimized by the dominant power structure and as capable of resisting or transforming that power structure.
Now we are going to see some aspects about cultural criticism and literature. For cultural critics, any type of literature is a cultural production, but in the same way, it shapes a cultural experience of the individual who interact with these literary works. Stephen Greenblatt talks about the reconstruction of the limits of the works. In other words, we must recognize the characteristics of the work which will show us the cultural expression that existed at the time the work was created. So, for this reason, he proposed a series of questions that we must take into account to be able to establish the cultural role that a literary work plays. The first question is what kinds of behavior, what practice does the work seem to enforce? In here, one begins to understand what roles of society are implicit in the work. For example, how the characters behave according to gender, race, socioeconomic status, or some other form of cultural expression. The second question is why might readers at a particular time and place find this work compelling? This question is not only based on the spatial temporal scope of the creation of the work, but at any moment in time. In other words, can a work from 19th century seem interesting today and not at another time, or vice versa? Why at the time of the creation of the work might it seem interesting but currently not? This can lead us to think about many causes, such as the context in which the reader is living when reading the work, or wishes, beliefs, thoughts, everything that made the content of the work interesting. For example, in literature, you could see that women were renegade to a secondary character which was only a complement to men, and that was something that at the time was liked. But why was it liked? Because machismo at that time was even greater, and therefore this type of literature had characteristics that encouraged this cultural expression. The third question is, are there differences between my values and the values implicit in the work I'm reading? Knowing the values of the reader, we can know why this work may or may not interest him. In other words, we can understand and analyze the cultural expression that a work brings to the reader, not only analyzing the work as an individual element, but also analyzing the work as an element in which the reader can see himself reflected. The next question is upon what social understanding does the work depend? Here, what must be taken into account is the point of view that the work has towards society. In other words, under what lens does the work see society? And what we can extract from this about the cultural expression of the work? The fifth question is whose freedom of thought or movement might be constrained implicitly or explicitly by this work? With this question, we can analyze what kind of discrimination could be implicit in the work and thus tell us a little more about the author, readers, and society. For example, the LGBT community. It is portrayed in works where their freedom of thought is limited and controlled. Okay, the next question is what are the larger social structures with which these particular acts of praise or blame, that is, the text's apparent ethical orientation, might be connected? Okay, these questions refer to what we should analyze is the ethical and moral aspects. Simplifying the terms, what is right, what's wrong, what is fair or unfair, etc. All these characteristics will give us the ethical orientation of the test which we could analyze. It is important to keep in mind that there are popular expressions of culture, such as movies, and we must contrast it with high types of cultural expressions, such as books. The way in which they adapt a book must be taken into account. So there are other methods that help us analyze how the adaptations of many literary works are modified. What we must do is to take a book and compare it with the film and find some forms of censorship. For example, character change, personality, contents, rates, etc. Finding all these elements will help us to analyze better these works. Even so, we should never forget that the analysis we do will also be an analysis that will be affected by the culture in which we live and interact. In other words, we will be making a cultural interpretation of a work and its cultural expression.
Okay, now it's time for some questions. Basically, these questions offers us ways to examine the cultural work performed by literary text. Taking into account, we can use new historical and cultural criticism properly only if we keep clearly in mind that our analysis is always incomplete, partial, and our perspective is always subjective. We cannot stand outside our own culture and analyze text from an objective point of view. We can write only from within our own historical moment. Okay, the first question. What it really means, or what it means basically, is that how does the text work taking into account the culture in that moment of history? For example, how much accurate is that literary text taking into account other texts from the same period of time, such as penal code, burden practices, educational priorities, the treatment of children under the law, and other art forms, and even attitudes towards sexuality. So it's basically how can that be examined in the text? The second question means how does the text make the dominant class undermine of or prevail? For example, as my classmate Maria Fernanda said, it is normal to see more emphasis on the high class. Even to show or describe them extremely ostentatious. It is normal too because it is necessary to make notable the differences in the social classes. For example, in the movie The Help, you can see how marvelous, in quotation marks, rich life is, and how low and sad is life for poor and black. The third question is basically how is the experience of marginal groups represented in the text? Where is the attitude of the undermined people in the text? For example, let's take a look to the song Gangsta's Paradise. In this song is where black people only thinking how to gain money, and they are conscious that they're living a life of crime and that they will raise under such a poor situation that their life is destined to end badly. That's basically being a gangster. To end this, well, another point. There's a phrase there that is, I'm educated fool with money on my mind. It's basically what I was clarifying before. Um, to end this, um, I'm gonna say an extra. But, well, depending on the literary text, we might ask one or any combination of these questions, or we might come up with a useful question not listed here specifically. These are just some starting points to get us thinking about literary text as historical and cultural critics do. Well, guys, thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed our presentation.